There's a kind of glory in the face of an old man. Not so with the stranger lying there. They had my papa looking like he was 52, cotton stuffed in his cheeks that erased the best wrinkles. Makeup powder and rouge plastered his face way up into his hair and around the neck and ears. His lips were painted. He was ready to step before the footlights of the matinee performance. I fiercely wanted to pluck out the cotton, but was afraid. At least the makeup could come off. I called for alcohol and linen. A very reluctant mortician brought them to me, and I began the restoration. As the powder, the rouge, the lipstick disappeared, the stranger grew older. He never recovered the look of his 92 years, but in the end, the man in the coffin became my papa. And then at the graveyard, the man continues, I say I smelled the fresh earth. There was none to be seen. What I did see is difficult to believe. I mean the green stuff. Someone had come before us and covered that good, wonderful, raw dirt, every clod of it, with green stuff. Everything, every scar of the grave was concealed under simulated grass. Just as if nothing at all were happening. What an offense against nature, against history, against Papa, against us, against God. I wanted to scream. I wanted to cry out to the whole world. Something is going on here, something great, something significantly human. Look, everybody, look. Here is my father's death. It's going on here. Thanks to flowers upon the green facade only added to the deception. Was it all contrived to pretend at this last moment that my father was not really dead after all? Was it not insisting that death is not important, not a lively part of our lives, not thoroughly human, not bestowed by the final one? Suddenly the great lie took on cosmic proportions, and suddenly I was physically ill. Well, that is a statement of a man dealing with the death of his father and feeling that he is removed from that all that the culture surrounds with death is keeping him from experiencing this as a human event with greater significance. It's one way of getting at the first problem that I want to raise, and that is that we live in a death-denying culture. That topic is one of the taboo topics. I suppose in the past it has been sexuality was sort of the taboo topic, and now that is talked about much more freely, and it seems as though death has sort of taken over that particular place of illusion in our culture. Everything, as we know, around the question of death is shrouded. I mean, all of the story here gives us that feeling like trying to deny that death is really happening. It's being covered over in one way or another. When people die, it seems as though one almost has to struggle to stay in touch with that. I'm recalling when my father died a number of years ago. I recall nurses saying, well, it might be difficult at the end, and maybe you might not want to be in the room or around, or maybe you want us there. I remember thinking to myself, no, I want to be there when my father dies. I think they handed us something to put in his mouth in case that he was, went into convulsions or something. And then I remember after he died, they wanted us to be out of the way when the morticians, the funeral directors came. And I remember insisting at that point, no, I wanted to be in the room. I wanted to help lift my father onto that thing they brought in to take him away. I wanted to go down with the body in the elevator. Well, I remember going through all of this same sort of thing, of wanting to deny the reality of this death. In fact, if I remember correctly, my own sister did exactly as this man did with his father and wanted to wipe away some of that makeup when my father was laid out in the funeral home. I remember at the gravesite of insisting that they lower the coffin down into the earth. And my mother and my sisters and I pick up some of the dirt there and put it on the coffin. It was all a way of, for me at least, of trying to stay in touch with the fact of death, the reality that it seems so hard to stay in touch with. So we live in a culture in many ways that is death-denying, taboo kind of topic. One of the problems with all of this is it diverts us from facing up to our own death. Martin Heidegger said that the real test of maturity in life is whether we are able to make the statement, not people die or they die, but am I able to make the statement and stay with it, I will die? Am I able to face my own mortality? And it seems as though in our culture that is a difficult kind of thing to do. There's many things that want to keep us from that. There's a celebration of a youth culture. There's a whole effort to stay young and to look young. There's the business of old people often being separated off from us and unable to, we don't see them enough and aren't in touch with that process of dying. All of that keeps us from making that authentic kind of statement, yes, I will die. So Heidegger says that's the mark of an inauthentic culture, a culture that is in decline, not able to deal with this ultimate kind of human reality. And now in the recent past, of course, this topic of death has been raised up again. We have courses on it, which seems to be a very good trend. We have a counter movement in the culture that Elizabeth Ross has helped us so much to see this more clearly. People know that name, woman doctor, much been in the news, and has really written a lot on death and dying, influenced so many of us. Elizabeth Ross tells the story of how seminarians came to her and wanted to talk about death, to find out something about death. And she says, well, I really don't know much about death. She says, I'm an MD, but I don't know a lot about it, but let's go talk to some dying people. So they went to a hospital and asked to be able to talk to some dying people. And they were informed at that time that there weren't any dying people in the hospital, which struck her as a little strange and alerted her to the full depth of the problem. Even in hospitals, you couldn't find people who were dying. Elizabeth Ross then began to investigate all of this and highlighted this death-denying element in the culture and its really bad effects. She found out that people who were dying knew they were dying and really wanted to talk about it. Even the clergy denied it. I can remember early in my years in visiting the hospital, it was a common thing to just sort of go in to the dying people and try to cheer them up, keep things light and frothy. That was part of a pastoral practice that we picked up someplace. I really don't know where. And again, it was part of the death-denying culture. Elizabeth Ross has changed the pastoral practice of clergy throughout the whole country, Catholic and Protestant and Jewish people. It really has changed it and has told us that no, when you go in and talk to the people who are dying, they want to talk about that. That's what's on their mind. That's what's significant to them. You have to give them space and time so that they can indeed deal with those deeper feelings that are gnawing at their guts. So that many of the clergy now have learned this, that it's not just time for sweetness and light, but it's time to sit down and to allow people to talk to one about death. Well, what we find, of course, is that if we have not thought it through ourselves or haven't one way or another dealt with this, that it's hard to take. It's hard to have someone sitting there, lying there, talking to us about their death. And so we find people fending it off and shortening the conversation, and it's time to leave now, or let's change the subject or something. So all, again, part of this death-denying culture, both societally and as it impacts on us as personal individuals. Now, to try to, as all we've done throughout this whole series of 18 lectures, we're trying to look at the human problems that we face, the spiritual quest to be able to cope with life, and we're looking to the great theologian Karl Rahner to give us some insights into that. I probably told you this before, but the first time I ever met Rahner, and after a rather lengthy conversation with him, in Munich, he put his arm around me and said, "Pray for my happy death." Death was very much on his mind all the time. It was a great part of his thinking. He himself went to the seminars at Freiburg conducted by Martin Heidegger, who is a great 20th century existentialist thinker who has focused attention for us upon this topic of death. In fact, that's how he thought of who we humans are. We humans are the ones who are in process of moving towards death. And Heidegger said that far from being morbid to be able to look at that, it was the freeing element. As I said, for him, the key thing in life, the most important thing in life of all, really, was to be able to face that ultimate boundary, to be able to come to terms with the fact that I will die. That, he felt, freed us up. By setting a boundary for us, it enabled us to make the most of all of the time that we have. He felt it was what enabled us to live resolutely, to know that we don't just have an indefinite number of tomorrows, puts greater significance in the mind of Rahner and Heidegger at least on each of the days that we do have. It isn't just an indefinite number of days ahead of us. There is a limited kind of number. And that tells us that we have to make the most of each of the days that we have. That we have to engage our freedom at each time. That's true of our loved ones. You know, sometime when we leave our loved ones, that's the last time we talk to them alive. It's a vivid memory in my mind of Easter Sunday and the last time that I took a walk with my father. It somehow seemed so important to me that that was a good occasion, that was a good time. And of course, the only way you could ever ensure that that would happen would be to make sure that each of our encounters has a sensitivity with it, and a closeness and an openness, and that we make the most of it. That's the only way one could ensure that the last time has the kind of quality that we would like it to have. You see, what I'm trying to say is that it sets the importance of each of the moments that we are given. It gives a deeper significance to each of our encounters as we go through life. So Heidegger insists, and Rahner goes along with this, that it is not a morbid thought, that it frees one up. It makes one to be a better person and to make the most out of the hours that we are given. Now, a second thing is that to be in touch with death reminds us of our general mortality and the fact that we are dependent on a power greater than ourselves. Obviously, one of our great problems in life is wanting to be God. That's something that the existentialist thinker John Paul Sartre shared with the author of the book of Genesis. That is, they both understood that the great human problem is wanting to be God, wanting to be able to control our existence, to have it in our own hands. And of course, what meditation on death and facing the ultimate limits of life, what that is all about is to say, I'm not independent. I am not autonomous. I am, in fact, a dependent creature. I am contingent. I don't have the power of my own being in my hands like I would like to have it. And it suggests that what I have to do in life is to be able to let go of that, to surrender all of that, and that will indeed somehow free us up. Whenever I'm talking to this, I flash on a priest I know who I think is terrific and really deals well with situations. I admire his calm and his peacefulness and his ability to deal with tough situations. So I have great admiration for this priest of our diocese. And one time he told a little story about himself that revealed to me, I think, his secret. And that is, he told me about a time when he was sleeping at night and he thought, for one reason or another, that he was going to have a heart attack. And I remember asking him, well, what did you do? And he said, well, I said an act of contrition and went to sleep. And it revealed to me, I think, in a way that a few other things could do, his secret of life. I remember being in a similar situation one time, and believe me, I did not go to sleep. I think it's part of this learning of our creaturehood. But I am, my dependency. And it's the great lesson in a way that it seems all of us have to think about. There's, you remember in Zorba the Greek, I don't know if this is going to come back to me exactly, but Zorba runs into the old fellow who's planting a tree, real old, and he's planting a tree, and he says, asks him, well, why are you planting a tree? You're so old. And he says, I live as though I would never die. And Zorba responds, that's funny. I live as though I would die at any moment. And that is why I am free. Remember that line from Zorba? I live as though I would die at any moment, and that is why I am free. In other words, it seems that the question of death and freedom are tightly tied together. To be able to live spontaneously, to make the most out of life, to live with a certain zest and feeling and intensity, it seems is promoted by this business of being able to face up to our death. I live as though I would die any moment, and that is why I am free. And of course, Zorba then gives us that feeling of this person who dances, who's with life, who's excited about life, and who's able to mine the riches of all of the moments that are given to him. We pick up another idea that Rahner likes. It's actually from the Russian thinker Berdyaev. It's interesting thing, since Berdyaev says that if indeed we would not die, then we would be in a position fated to be always unhappy. That death is really the only possibility we've got to ever get what we want, and that is the fulfillment of the deepest longings of our heart. It's the one shot we got. Where Berdyaev says that if life just went on indefinitely, as it is now, then it would indeed be hell. It would be hell because there would never be that final resting place, that final bit of life. As my mother often tells me, there's just got to be something better than this. Her favorite line, there's got to be something better than this. And I think that captures the thought. Death as a limitation, is our one chance. It's our one shot of possibility. Who knows what's beyond there? No one tells us about it. No, but it is the one chance we have to have the longings of our heart for a total love, for a total knowledge, for total experience to be fulfilled. Interesting idea to ponder, I think. Perhaps as well, this business of facing death, which we're trying to emphasize here, gives us an empathy for other people. It makes us able to then be with those who are suffering now. Some of you remember the gentleman who used to walk in here for the lectures. He carried a blanket. He used to come down. I was never sure if he was going to make it over those steps there or not. Earl Harris. He had everything in the world wrong with him, heart, kidneys, everything else. I learned an awful lot from that man. I used to go visit him in the hospital, saw him in the nursing home often. And to be with Earl with all this was in a different kind of, it was a counter-cultural world. In other words, Earl talked freely about dying. Earl would say things like, well, yes, I would really like to die, but I don't seem to be able to do it. Earl's laying there in the worst kind of thing. I mean, I don't want to get graphic about it, but he's there in terrible suffering and everything, and I talked to him about it, and Earl says to me, well, it's only pain. That's a line I don't think I'll ever forget in my whole life in the way he said it. It's only pain. I don't even know what that means. I can't even, my imagination won't allow me to even begin to wrap around the meaning of that statement. Oh, it's only pain, as he explained it. The thing about Earl was that, as a matter of fact, he could have died. any time he wanted, but he didn't for the sake of others who were not ready to prepare to deal with his death. He was on dialysis, and all he had to do was not go to dialysis for a few times. But he wouldn't die, he told me. He'd like to, but he's not going to do it because people weren't ready yet to accept his death. Well, Earl is, telling me things about, being able to talk openly about it, about empathizing. I'd come there and Earl would, ask me, well, what did you lecture on last week? Tell me what's going on. Let's talk theology, he'd say. He knew he was dying. That's what used to come his lectures. He knew he was dying. His body was going. He always said his body is a total wreck. Everything was wrong with him. And he'd sit down there and coughing up stuff and everything. But he said he wanted to keep his mind alive. He wanted to keep his heart alive in that sense of warmth and empathy for other people. Powerful statement about when one is able to face up to death, it seems to me it frees one up to be empathetic. He was giving out the positive vibes, you understand? He was the one cheering up people who came to see him. He was the one that was interested in what other people were doing and going through were coming to visit him. It just seemed rare to me. All I can say is that I learned so much from that man. I remember having his funeral, and it seemed to me to be so significant. He had touched so many lives throughout when he was healthy and vigorous and a teacher and a principal and so on. But he had also touched so many other people. I remember a man saying, I've probably repeated this before, we were sitting in a group discussion and Earl was making some comments, and the guy just said, I hope when it comes my time to carry the cross, I will do it as gracefully as you have done. So here is this man in touch with what's going on and therefore helping others. Good vibrations coming out from him all over the place. Well, but the truth of the matter is that death is a part of life. That death is what we are about. Death is, as Heidegger liked to say, an existential. It is what co-determines us. We're the creatures under the universal death sentence. We move towards death. That's part of what and who we are. And the denial of that diminishes our humanity. The denial of it keeps us from being as self-aware as we need to be. To just push that aside always is to be in a position of only knowing part of ourselves and only knowing part of what we are really all about. So we started out with a man at the graveside saying, don't they know something significant is going on here? Don't they understand that there's a human reality here? Death denied. And yet, if we're going to be fully human, function effectively, we're going to have to be able to say someday, not only my loved ones will die, but I will die. And far from being morbid, that seems to be life-releasing. Why don't we take a little break here? I'm going to invite you to turn to the person next to you and... If not, I will launch again here. The next...
in your experience with this whole idea of the theology of it and psychology of it, would you agree with, I think it's Menninger who said that we die when we want to die, not an hour sooner, not an hour later? How do you feel about that?
Of course, it's asked about a statement by Carl Menninger, I guess, who said we die precisely the time when we want to die, in a way. I'm probably can incorporate that into my comments I'm going to make now. I mean, I think that I certainly would want to make some distinctions in looking at that statement. I mean, I think there's many ways in which it isn't true. I suppose there's elements that I could affirm as well. I mean, I think that in general, it's precisely what we don't have control over, and that's important to know. I think there's other ways in which it's set up. I mean, you hear the stories of the death camps when people thought they would be liberated on a certain day and then weren't, would die immediately afterwards. or people who wait for a big celebration or for a relative to get there before they die. I mean, I'm sure that's in there. You hear all the stories. I've talked to people like that. I'm sure there's an element of that in there. So it is very, I'd have to be careful of that. I mean, surely we don't control our death to that point that we're going to say precisely when we're going to die.
In the Goethe, he's supposed to have died, but he lived until he finished Faust, and then he died.
Yeah. Well, the question or the statement was made about Goethe, who I think, if I'm not mistaken, used to sleep with a dagger under his pillow, just in, as sort of a way of testing himself or living with the dark forces. But that he waited to die till after he completed Faust. It doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, it seems to me that we get a sort of energy flow going for a project, or we got some reason that we have to stay alive. And I think we get glimpses of that in just being able to rev ourselves up for a given task at a given time when we need to do it. I mean, I don't think that's too surprising. But on the other hand, I think that I would be very careful of saying, that we somehow have that kind of control. I don't think we do. I'm going to use it as a springboard to take up the next section here of what I want to talk about, and that is to try to get at the question of what death is in its essence. What is it all about? Now, the common way out of Greek philosophy, especially a Platonic notion, is that death is the separation of body and soul. Now, I suppose in the common Christian understanding, it comes out something like this, that when the time comes, your body dies, but your soul stays alive and leaves. I know when I was a little kid, I don't know why, but I thought of death as being a moment as the soul being wrapped in a brown paper wrapping, and when one died, it sort of took off. I don't know why I thought that, but it was part of the Platonic dualism that is in Christian circles. That is, that it is the notion that somehow we humans are composed of a body and a soul, in which the soul is sort of stuck in the body, and when death happens, it's released and goes up to heaven, or maybe goes down to hell, which is even more frightening. As a way of thinking about death. So that is seems to be part of the way that we have grown up with and comes to us from the world of Greek philosophy. I think there's problems with that, and I'm going to try to point those out as we go along. Perhaps another way of thinking of death as the essence of death as having sort of nothing to do with what went before in life. Sort of a way of thinking of death that isolates it out from everything else. One way of getting at that is the question of deathbed conversion. That's a troublesome point for many people, isn't it? Especially, wasn't this just in the news recently? Or in the paper, John Wayne? Who am I remembering this from? So many people are upset, thinking about the Duke living this marvelously free life and doing whatever he felt like doing and so on, and then coming down and at the last moment making a deathbed conversion. And here I am, all my life, living this disciplined, routine, Christian life, and the Duke gets it all at the end. I mean, the sort of isolation of that moment of death as though it really is unconnected with what has gone before. I think, again, we'll try to get at that in maybe a little deeper kind of way. Then there is the notion that death is the extinction of it all, the absolute end of everything, that one simply, upon one's death, that's the end of one's existence. It usually goes with a denial of the existence of God. However, it also is in the minds of some people who believe in God. I've talked to people who believe in God but have trouble accepting that there is an afterlife. Now, we have historical precedent for that, don't we? Of course, our own ancestors in the faith, the Hebrews. So through most of their history before the coming of Christ, they had no real sense of the afterlife. That's what created many of their problems. They believed in God, Yahweh, but they did not have a concept of an afterlife, of continuing on. And so they thought that you were rewarded in this life. If you lived well, you had a big family and a lot of offspring. If you were faithful to God, you'd be a wise person. You'd get it together. You would live effectively and so on. But very little thought of an afterlife. In fact, it may have well been into about the 2nd century B.C. before they got around to the idea that, as we read in the Book of Wisdom, maybe written around 150 B.C., that the souls of the just are in the hands of God. It took them a long time to get to that. But up to that point, for them, death was just the end of personal existence as we know it. But that was okay for them on those terms. Rahner likes to make the point that we don't want to put down atheists and death. He says we shouldn't as believers think that atheists die less well than believers. Well, he says he doesn't think that can be empirically verified. That the non-believer very often can live nobly, and we think of somebody like Albert Camus, able to live nobly and to face death resolutely without belief in God or afterlife. So one of the theories of what death is all about is it simply ends the human journey for us and no more personal existence. I might just throw in one other kind of idea that we get from the Eastern world, Eastern religions, and that is that what happens in your death is that you are merged into the all. You are like a drop that upon death means you fall into the ocean, and now you are simply part of the ocean. You no longer have a personal center of consciousness. One's self and self-awareness is extinguished. That's it. So you've got a variety of outlooks on what happens in death. Separation of body and soul, the escape of the soul from this prison that we know as the body, and this last-minute illumination notion of sudden conversion, the Eastern kind of notion, and so on. Now, let's try to take a look at what Rahner says about death and what he thinks it is all about. Because I think it is an interesting kind of theory, and it maybe gets a little bit difficult to follow here, but I will try to say it in some simple terms. I will struggle for those words, I think. Rahner thinks, to say it in summation, Rahner thinks that in death we have an interesting and intriguing and most important combination of passivity and activity. That's why I thought the question, leads me into this. So let's take, first of all, the passivity notion. For Rahner, clearly, death is an eruption from outside. It's like the grim reaper coming to get us. Comes unbidden, and contrary to the point we were making before, we don't seem to have any control over all of that. We're under this universal death sentence, but we don't know when it's going to be carried out. So there is a way, when we think about death and watch people die and so on, in which it's external, which it's outside of ourselves. People can get hit by a car and die. It's unbidden. Sometimes we die before we want to. Other people want to die and can't seem to do it, as Earl was saying, but it comes like the thief in the night. So there is a passivity about it, like, what are you going to do? I'm not ready. I don't have my book finished yet. It's too soon to die. But if it's time, you die anyway. So it has that kind of external character that produces in us a passivity. There it is. But the other side of it, in which is Rahner's real emphasis kind of point, is that death is an activity, that it is something we do. In fact, Rahner insists that it is the freest moment that we ever have. That death is something to do. It's not the escape of the soul from the body. He would insist it's not like our body dies and our soul lives. For Rahner, death is the whole person. We die. We do it as a total person, as body and soul. That's what we have to do. And the way he thinks that is that it is this freest moment we ever have when all the chips are on the table, when the stakes are high. And the real choice at this moment is to selfishly hang on, to try to be autonomous, to be self-sufficient, or to let go and allow ourselves to fall into the hands of the gracious one. He thinks that's the very choice that we have. He says it doesn't matter if you get killed quickly or die slowly. He thinks that death is something we do and are conscious about and have free control over, in the sense of what attitude will we take up at this particular moment. Rahner likes to insist that from this theological perspective, it doesn't have a lot to do with clinical death. That he thinks that people die, that we don't really know when they die in this theological sense, but it may well not correspond with the moment when the brain waves cease. And this is an interesting parallel with Elizabeth Ross's fifth stage, where people are in the dying process and they are angry and bargain with God and all of those stages one goes through. But then there is the moment of peace. You know, and it could well be that what Rahner is talking about corresponds with that moment of peace. That time when one now has surrendered. And when you hear these stories about it, people's pain seem to cease, and they get quiet, and their face changes, and they seem to be either ready to hand themselves over, or maybe they've already handed themselves over. So, interesting idea, isn't it? That maybe this kind of death that what Rahner means here is doesn't happen exactly when the heart stops or the brain waves stop. Active kind of thing, something that we end up doing. So that in this way, death would be summing up what we have been throughout all of our lives. It would be a way of pulling together what we have been about. It would be the culmination of all of our free acts. I used it when we talked about freedom. I said that for Rahner, the question of freedom was not I could change my mind, do this, sit up, get up, go to a different school, whatever. But the essence of freedom is to make ourselves to be what we will be forever. To complete the process, to fund this treasure that's inside of us, to prepare ourselves for the afterlife. And so in that viewpoint, I mean, a deathbed conversion would never be separated out from the rest of life, from one's personal history. You know, it may take some sort of a turnaround point, but all of that from another viewpoint would be connected in with what has happened before, with prayers, with love that one has received, maybe with good things done that no one ever noticed before. All of those things would be connected. So the death in this viewpoint is not separated out from the rest of life. It's our ability to pull it together. It's our moment of freedom when we sum up what we are all about, pull that together, and then try to hand it over to the great God. Now, what Rahner would like to say is, well, in my notes I was reminding myself about the New Testament. He liked that the day that at the time of earthly life is the day that is followed by the night when no one can work. So that, how can I get hold of this here? Reincarnation. Let's bring that up. Rahner really thinks that as a Christian, we cannot hold reincarnation. I mean, he's open to most every other idea that's available around. But reincarnation to him doesn't make sense in terms of this kind of notion of freedom. Because he says reincarnation is based on the idea that we need more time to get it together. We need more experiences, more activity, more opportunities to test our goodwill and so on. And Rahner says it's got nothing to do with an extended period of time with more opportunities. It wouldn't make any difference. because death is the summing up, the culmination of all. It's making definitive, final, irrevocable what our history has been to that point. That too abstruse. I mean, you see what I'm trying to say is that for Rahner, it is the ending of all. He thinks that's the meaning of the Hebrew notion of Sheol. You know, when we say in the Creed that he descended into hell, that word hell there is eventually a translation of the Hebrew Sheol. Sheol was the shadowy place where the dead people went. And Rahner thinks that Hebrew doctrine of Sheol was simply a statement that, well, it's all over. Life as we know it ceases. Another way of saying it, for Rahner, eternity is not like a long time, as many people think of it. Eternity doesn't have anything to do with duration for him. To die means we cease the time-space dimension as we know it. We break out of that. Eternity comes and meets us in a way. It's not like we then live a long time after that. It is that we've reached the fulfillment of what our life has been all about. I can tell from faces that that's a difficult notion. Maybe questions or whatever will be able to get at this in a little bit better way. Now, Rahner, as always, wants to put these ideas together. He says that, I try to present two things. There's a way in which death is passive, and I'm taken over by it. The other way is that it's active, that that's something I do. I die my death. I freely do it. Now, he says that what we've got to do is to see how those come together, so that my real freedom is involved in accepting the fact that I don't control this moment. I'm exercising my freedom by accepting my passivity. Oh, that's what he thinks we're doing in death. We're saying, in simpler words maybe, I surrender. I don't fight it. That doesn't mean that people who are sick aren't supposed to fight to make their health better and get the will to live and so on. But in Rahner's mind, when this moment comes, then what we're called upon to do is accept the fact that we don't control it. Live out our passivity. It seems to me that we try to learn to do that in life in many ways. I don't think it's an odd notion. It is in that prayer of serenity when I simply learn to accept what I can't change. And so Rahner says that's what freedom is really all about. The deepest notion of freedom is to accept our dependency. And that's what's so hard to do and what we can't seem to do. That's why he says the whole key to the spiritual life is self-acceptance. And the self that we are is dependent, and the self we are will die. That's the way he thinks those two things come into sort of a dialectical tension here. So that death is not a separation of the body and soul, but it is an activity and a passivity of the total person that I am. Now, when we, in the tradition, try to explain this, we've had two major ways of getting hold of this, what comes after this moment of death. One has been the immortality of the soul. That is the Greek notion. It comes from us, the notion that the soul is somehow in the body and the soul lives on. That's what we are commonly say. That's what we are used to. Know that our task in life is to save our soul. May his soul be at peace, we say. May his soul ascend to heaven and be with the angels. It's one of our traditional ways of speaking about the afterlife, or what comes after the moment of death. But that's not the biblical way of speaking about it. That's not the Hebrew way. The other notion, which helps us get at another side of it, is resurrection of the body. So the Hebrews believed in resurrection. The early Christians talked in terms of the afterlife as resurrection, meaning there was a heavy emphasis on the bodiliness, that our bodies are transformed, as Paul said. So that the body is not just left behind, but that the body shares in all this. The body is transformed. It's a way of saying that we get to heaven as a total person. In fact, Rahner thinks, one of his more radical thoughts, I suppose, that the resurrection of the body occurs exactly at the moment we die. Like you don't wait for thousands and thousands of years till the world finally gets to an end, but that resurrection of the body, and you can see in his full thought why this is obviously so, the resurrection of the body occurs exactly when we die. Because the two ideas, immortality of the soul and resurrection of the body, are just two different ways of saying that we get to heaven as a total person. In fact, Rahner thinks, one of his more radical thoughts, I suppose, that the resurrection of the body occurs exactly at the moment we die. Like you don't wait for thousands and thousands of years till the world finally gets to an end, but that resurrection of the body, and you can see in his full thought why this is obviously so, the resurrection of the body occurs exactly when we die. Because the two ideas, immortality of the soul and resurrection of the body, are just two different ways of saying the same thing. That is, that at our death, our personal being is not extinguished. We're not like a candle and blowing out the flame, as we would get in Buddhism, for example. It's not that kind of extinguishing of the self, that we as a total person live on. And it's hard. So, the two ideas. Thus, what we would end up saying in one way or another is, to get another image of this, is death is a passageway into a new and richer kind of life. Now, one of my best analogies for this comes from my own mentor, John Macquarie, the great Anglican theologian. He said, if you want to get a little feel for what this would be like, the only analog we have in human experience is this. When the human species evolved from animal life, when we had animal life and it moved into reflective life. In other words, when we had the first human, what has happened? Well, the nervous structure, the bodiliness, all of the animality is not left behind. It moves into, crossed the threshold of reflection, as K.R. says, and then we had the great explosion, that moment, the explosion of human consciousness. Nothing left behind, but now that animal existence is lived in a bigger context. It's a context now of human communication, of possibility of love, of sharing, of learning, of knowledge. Macquarie says that's a way to think about what this passageway might be that we call death. We don't leave anything behind in this way. Just as the animal didn't leave anything behind in moving into reflective life. But we do move into a richer context where life is more thrilling and intense, where communion is more possible, where there's peace and harmony, where love and knowledge are fulfilled. Isn't that an interesting analogy to me about what that might be when we move through this pathway that we call death into a richer and better kind of life? Not like the body is the first stage of a rocket, which is then just jettisoned and forgotten, but whatever it is that makes us human, whatever it is that makes this being that we are up, it's taken up into the heavenly abode, to use the biblical kind of imagery. And then finally in this section, Rahner always insists that we connect death with sin. But in this way, and here's a subtle playoff in what many people read in the Scriptures. In other words, it almost sounds in the Scriptures as though, well, Adam and Eve would not have died, but then they committed a sin, and the result is now they have to die. And Rahner says, no, that can't be. Well, that can't be the way it looks. He would say that no matter what our situation, apart from sin, we would have to die. We'd have to reach a culmination. We'd have to sum it up, pull it together, find the final fulfillment of the longings of the heart. It's the only way we could ever achieve happiness that goes with being with God. So he said, no matter whether it's sin or not, we would have to die. That's just part of being human and getting to wherever it is we want to be. But he says what sin introduces into the whole problem of dying and the experience of dying is its hiddenness, its darkness, which gives it its scary character. Obviously, a great part of the problem of death is the unknown. So we're not sure if we can trust to let ourselves go completely and fall backwards, whether we will fall into gracious hands or not. That becomes the problem. It's hidden. It's scary. You can't be sure of it. It's unknown. It's got anxiety connected with it. It's what makes us feel funny sometimes when we get up in the morning. We got no definite problem to face, but our guts are churning and we don't know if we can make it or not. It's the threat of non-being. It's the threat of contingency. So Rahner says what sin has introduced into the equation is not death itself. We'd die anyway. But death, sin, has darkened our minds, kept us from being able to see clearly what death is all about. It's introduced selfishness and attempt to be autonomous and to control and manipulate and to be greedy for more. That's what sin has introduced. And therefore that complicates the dying process for us, especially by introducing angst, anxiety, scary character to all of that. Well, what I was trying to do here is get at the essence of death. What is it? And trying to get away from what I think is an older classical Christian viewpoint that death simply means that separation of body and soul. And instead, Rahner is saying, no, death is a total person act in which we accept the fact that we don't control our lives, in which we surrender to the gracious mystery, and in doing so, we fall into a richer and better kind of life, a life in which is fulfilled all of the deepest longings of our heart. I'm going to stop there again. And what the other kinds of ideas I did have here. And that is, third problem is that one can distinguish out the problem of dying from the problem of death. A lot of people say, well, I don't fear death, but I do fear dying. I fear the process of moving towards death. This would be the fear of getting old. The emphasis on the youth culture, of keeping ourselves young-looking, the sort of fighting against the march of time in our own lives. Then this experience of in other words, death, Rahner thinks that death is present in our lives all the time. And that part of the way we feel it, and I alluded to this before, is the angst that takes us over. The times when we don't feel right, like we're not in control, like there's butterflies in the stomach and so on, but there's no good reason for it. Rahner says that's death knocking on the heart. That is the creatureliness that is around us. That's the threat of non-being, the threat that we don't control our existence. And he says that fundamental angst that we periodically have, people get it at different times of the day. I get it in the morning. Other people, I find, they get it at night. They can't sleep. But angst can take us over at any time. Sometimes it goes through weeks or months or years and we're fine, and then angst suddenly gets us. So it can come unbidden in any kind of way. Some people live with it all day long, every day. And but the feeling of angst then gets sharpened at the time of illness. I have a clear thing in my own mind, when I came to grips with my own finiteness, an illness that I had. And it just shook me to the core. It just sort of changed everything. It was the first time in my life, I suppose, that somehow it became clear to me, I will die. Up till that point, it was just sort of like a remote possibility. I suppose other people are more mature than that and more insightful. But for me, it was just a striking. The illness itself, hardly life-threatening in itself, was to me such a shock. I mean, a psychic shock that I've just, it stayed with me ever since. That moment is just etched in my consciousness. It was a moment of coming to terms with finiteness. So that illness has a way of sharpening the sense that we are in the dying process all the time. And of course, when this really gets difficult, then is in the last stages. And Rahner says, powerful things about, let's not talk glibly, about this neat dying process. He says, look, for a lot of people, what does it mean? It means isolation. It means being cut off. It means pain and suffering. It means inability to communicate very often. It means that one's powers are weakened. It means that one's energy and will is sapped in a way. That one is more prey, in a sense, to temptation, to not being able to be in touch with the Lord. His powerful passages, gripping things about the, the real wintry character of the dying process, which of course thought brings angst, which creates a certain anxiety in us. So that the truth of the matter is that dying is a part of life. We're always in process of dying from the first moment we are living. Dying is an existential. It's a part of the very structure of human existence. And it does things to our mind and heart even without us knowing it. In other words, I have the feeling that much of the compulsive behavior in life, the drinking, the pleasure-seeking, the workaholic thing, the smoking, whatever it is the compulsive behavior is connected with this fear, finally, of death. That it's our way of warding off angst. That's what it's really all about. It's a way of warding it off, keeping that chaos at bay through these various activities. I just keep busy enough, then I don't have to think about it. And so the compulsive behavior is something that we have to look at in terms. And of course, then what Rahner says, that the big thing is that that not to live with the compulsiveness, but we got to learn to live with the dying, and that we have to, in a sense, practice for our death. Part of my response to your thing. That's we have to get ready for it, because that's the big time. That's when the chips are on the table. And therefore, we prepare for it. And one of the ways we prepare for it is simply by trying to accept the diminishments, to use Teilhard de Chardin's phrase, that come our way. All of the diminishments. The times when we begin, the muscles aren't as supple as they once were. I can't swing the golf club as well as I would like to or think that I used to. Words well chosen there. So that all the diminishments of life, when one gets a little bit forgetful, or the mind isn't as sharp as it once was. So that part of what we've got to learn is to grow old gracefully, to move towards that moment with a certain elan, or a certain quiet grace, maybe. And the other way that we prepare for it, he would say, is through voluntary renunciation. This is one part of the meaning of asceticism in the Christian life. It's the reason for giving things up, of purposely not drinking or smoking or eating or doing 100 other kinds of things which are in danger of being compulsive. That is, that we are then learning to let go. We are practicing for the big moment in a way. But not just, you see, as a sense of, well, that moment is isolated, but it's that way that I'm learning to surrender, and that's the only thing that can free me up today. Well, wasn't it when Vince Dwyer was here, didn't he do such a tremendous job of talking about how we could be enslaved by things? What we're trying to do in the spiritual life is get unencumbered. Get free, get loose, get the Spirit flowing, so that we can live well and spontaneously. So, what I'm saying, we have to practice for all of this as we go along throughout life. Then he says, also, there seems to be a proper explicit thinking about the end of one's life. I must say that sometimes I've dealt with people who will talk so openly, they know they're going to die, and they say, gone through this. Well, at the funeral, I want so-and-so to sing a song. I want you to give the homily. I want you to make sure afterwards that you talk to my husband and make sure that he's doing all right. You know, I'd like, here's how the kind of mood or tone I want. I mean, that's sort of amazing, and again, maybe people find that morbid, but I'm thinking of a very specific example. I find it very enlightening, illuminating, and inspiring. Saronder thinks there is a proper way of previsioning that, or preparing for it in one way or another. I must say that I think that is an important part of moving toward this more authentic kind of existence. Then Rahner says that there are styles of dying. That, I mean, in different cultures, in different ways. You know, I said this before here, the Maasai tribe, the way their style of dying was to take the old people out and chain them to a tree and let the animals eat them up. It was a style of dying that was very alienating. Now, there was another style of dying, interesting, correlates to other cultures. There's another style of dying that was very close and, you know, was surrounded by family, where it was almost a natural part of what is going on. I think very often religious orders have had this kind of sense. That one gathers around, one is in the community, and it's just a natural progression into the afterlife. Oh, it's sort of an ordinariness. Well, Mother Teresa and her nuns, when they take care of those people in Calcutta, you know, you hear them talk about that. I mean, dying is just every hour occurrence. It just happens. It's there. They live with it, and they move and swing easily with it. That's a style of dying that is non-alienating, that brings one in. And I suppose in our own culture, very often, and part of the problem with that is the impersonal character of dying in a hospital and in an unfamiliar surrounding, and maybe without one's loved ones around. For us Christians, what we would like to think of is the last rites being part of this, the final sacraments, the anointing of the sick. We have an interesting change in practice this way now. Instead of, waiting till someone's really almost dead or have died and the priest rushing in and saying a few prayers and anointing, what we like to think now of the anointing of the sick as being a communal celebration. Sometimes they have them at masses now, bring them to the church with everybody else, or at least to have the family there and have the dying person conscious, and part of the praying and everything is to say, we're with you. We know this is a lonely experience, but we want to be around and part of all of this. So the gathering seems to be rather crucial in all of this. And not just to the last moment, which I think that sometimes we put too much emphasis on, but all of that time when people are diminished, when they get sick and so on. It seems like that's the quality time we want to spend with people. Be there with them and trying to integrate. And so the anointing of the sick is a way of saying, hey, you're still with the community. We're there. The priest representing, as James says, representing the community, comes and prays over the sick person. Have the family present. Have everybody around praying, especially while the dying person is still conscious. Then, Rahner insists for us that we've got to be careful not to think too heavily about that. We don't want to exactly test ourselves ahead of time. It's not clear, how we're going to handle that. Rahner says that what we want to do is let that recede into the mystery. You don't want to talk glibly about those sufferings as being easily redemptive and bringing us closer to God. He says, let's not talk that easily about it. Let's have a bit of silence about it, about that suffering of the last time, and let's hand that over. Let's let that into the silence of God. It's the mystery of human suffering very clearly brought in front of us. That might lead me, and I'm not going to take a break here, and I'll try to wind up here, summarize my thing. Well, I've got a lot of notes here yet. This compression time. Why don't you, while I figure out how to do this, why don't we do one-to-one discussion just for a minute? So let me take up the final section of what I want to talk about here, and that is the Christian notion of dying. A lot of times I suppose the problem with this is that there's a presumption that the Christian notion is sort of negative. We start talking about Christ, we got cross and suffering and agony and a really heavy kind of trip. It's often in the history of Christianity been portrayed that way. Jesus crucified and the sufferings and so on have become sort of the center point of the whole faith. And so what we've got to do, I think, is look at Christ's death and in more positive terms and to see how that ends up affecting us. So what we want to say is that Jesus Christ, human like us in all things except sin, takes on death in all of its stark reality. He accepts that. The agony in the garden represents that struggle. Father, if possible, don't make me do this. He's got the same angst here, the same sort of problem with the sufferings involved. And so, but in the midst of that anxiety over the whole thing, he ends up saying, but not my will, but thine be done. And so he prepares himself, just as he prepared himself all throughout his life. And then he goes to his death, as the Scriptures tell us, freely and obediently. He dies freely. That's the big thing about the death of Jesus. It highlights Ronner's understanding of what death is all about. It's not that they just come and get him. John's Gospel is very clear on this. And he's in the garden, they come to get him, and Jesus says a word to them, and they all fall over. Now, in John's Gospel, they could have just walked away at any point. But he doesn't do that because he's going to die freely. He's decided to do this, decided to be obedient to the will of his Father. And so the free character of death is highlighted. The sufferings are terrible and immense, although not as bad as many people have suffered in life. We don't want to overplay that. After all, it's very brief compared to the years of torture that some people have undergone in our own time in prison camps and in political prisoners and so on, the horrible sufferings people have had over an extended period of time. So we don't want to overplay the agony of the death of Jesus in relationship to so many other deaths that would be far more horrible. And yet there is that. And then there is, again, the moment of darkness, the unknown character of death. Father, why have you forsaken me? Represented in those words. But then again, the trusting attitude and this notion of what Ronner thinks death is, this active handing over, into your hands I commend my spirit. And then, not the end, but the beginning. A new life, richer, better life, resurrection, validation of his mission, vindication of all that he taught. What we mean by resurrection. Again, for Ronner, resurrection of Jesus doesn't really occur 3 days later, but resurrection occurs immediately. That with the emptying, there is the filling up. So in the process, what we say as believing Christians is that Christ now has conquered death, that it now has a new character, that its sting has been taken away from it, that it has been transformed. We have this interesting notion in the Scriptures that anyone who believes in Christ will never die. That's a theme throughout the Scriptures. If we are believers, we will never die. Now we have to ask ourselves, what does that mean? It doesn't mean that we escape this whole thing we're calling about death, but it means that we stay alive to God, that there is the afterlife, that there is the continued existence. So that what the Christian life is all about is, in a sense, a dying with Christ in order to share his life, the risen life. Much of our sacramental understanding is along this line. You know how people were baptized in the early church? They were baptized in a big pool, and after the whole scrutinies of Lent and so on, the Easter Vigil, they walked down into the waters, stepped down underneath the waters, then came out the other side, given the new garments, the lighted candle, and so on. Paul picks up that and he says, what is happening? We are dying to the old self. We're dying to sin and rising to a new life in Christ. So what do we say? That baptism is our way of participating in the death and resurrection of Christ sacramentally, symbolically, in sign. In the Eucharist, we say the same thing. What? We proclaim the death of the Lord until He comes. Every Mass is sacramentally going through that same process of dying and rising. And all of that is preparation in life for the moment when the chips are on the table, when we are called upon to die with Christ and to rise with Him. Now, what that suggests, it seems to me, is a whole hopeful attitude towards the whole thing. So it seems to me as we reflect on our loved ones who have died, there has to be a proper letting go. There has to be a proper handing this over to God. There has to be a faith conviction that love is stronger than death itself. The death can't puncture those bonds of love, can't destroy them. It seems to me to be, what it's telling us, that this coming together with Christ means that death isn't what it looks like. It looks like the end. And faith says, no, from this other angle of vision, from this perspective of the Lord, I see that there's something deeper going on, that the emptying, which we call death, really frees us up and allows us to be filled. That's the paradox. Die in order to come to life. So when we bring in Christ here and see it from that perspective, then the hiddenness of death, while still scary, we think cannot overwhelm us. Well, while the angst is going to be there, still the faith enables us to deal with that. While we may fear for our loved ones who have died, the faith conviction is that they're in the hands of God. The faith conviction is that Jesus has gone ahead of us to prepare a place for us to go, and that's where our dead loved ones have gone. That's what we have to keep coming back to, it seems to me. So that Christ represents the example of how to do it. I don't want to do it hard, but I will do it. It's dark. Why have you forsaken me? Why do I feel so alone? But Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. It seems like that's the style of living that Christ recommends to us and the kind of thing that could sustain us as we would go through this process that we know is death. The final conviction would be resurrection, final fulfillment, sharing in the life of the risen Lord, moving through death as passageway into a better life. That seems to me what sustains us as Christians and really gives us our hope in the midst of the anxiety that may well threaten us very deeply. We're open now for comments, questions, sharing in any way. We'll take a few minutes to do this and see what happens.
It seems like the great dedication of the Christian life and the duty to share. As we sort of look at one's life and see.
Don't you think there's a way in which we have to live with our temperament? We have to live with, we try to improve, and, those of us who are melancholic by nature and tend to see the dark side of life, that's just the way we are. We might try it, it might be hard to get rid of it, but that's the way we are. And it seems to me there's sort of an acceptance of that. It just says, well, it's okay. I add it up, it comes out -10, but I'll live with -10. Don't you think, isn't there a way we learn to live with our temperaments and make the best of it as we go through our day? I'm all for changing, that's why I want to do the 5 minutes tonight of different kind of thinking. But after that, and with all our efforts, it's sort of like that. This is me, and I got to die my way, in a sense. And that might be with a lot of darkness, and with a lot of discouragement. And to you, O Lord, those who once belonged to me and have now left me. And then to our own, my loved ones are silent because they live just as we chatter so loudly to try to make ourselves forget that we are dying. My waning life is becoming more and more a life with the dead. I live more and more with those who have gone before me into the dark night where no person can work. By your life-giving grace, O Lord, let it become evermore a life of faith in your light. Amen. We'll meet again next week, the final one. It'd be nice to invite anyone who's